Hi everyone, it's Melissa, and today I am going to share with you the books that I read in September. So I've already posted about this, but during most of September, I was having problems concentrating on reading. So I didn't read the normal amount that I would, but I did finish one physical novel. I listened to another on audiobook, and I read a bunch of graphic novels, like middle grade graphic novels. So the first three books I'm not really going to talk about because they're part of a manga series. The Girl from the Other Side, I read volumes 4, 5, and 6. They're like an all ages manga. They're appropriate for children. They're a little spooky, a little creepy. The series revolves around this girl who has been abandoned on the outside of the city walls. So in this world, the inside is quote unquote safe, and the outside is populated by outsiders. These creatures who, well, these once humans who have been cursed and turned into the kind of like these non-human creatures. And if they touch you, you become cursed and you become an outsider. And we follow this outsider and this girl who he is caring for. So obviously this is partway through the series. Overall, I would say I really enjoy this series. It has a very fairy tale feel, very spooky and eerie, and has this nice like kind of mystery quality to it. The last couple of volumes, the story has started to drag a little bit. I hope the rest of the series is going to kind of wrap things up a little bit, because I feel like the last two were kind of padded and like stretching out the series for no good reason. So that had me a little bit disappointed, but I still enjoyed them, just not quite as much as the first few. So that's all I will say about those. If you like comics or manga, then I would definitely suggest picking them up. So the other graphic novel I want to talk about before I get into the last two books is When Stars Are Scattered. And this is by Victoria Jamison and Omar Mohamed. This was absolutely fantastic. It is mostly a memoir. Some details in the book were changed just for more cohesive, I think, storytelling, but the kind of main plot points of the book are truly what happened. So Omar Mohamed and his younger brother are Somali, and Omar and his brother Hassan were refugees as very young children. I think they were like 3 or 4-ish years old, and they escaped to Kenya and grew up, like literally grew up in a refugee camp. And this tells their story from when Omar is about, I think the story starts when he's about 10 or 11, and it goes through to when he's college age, so maybe like 18, 19 years old. I already returned it to the library, and I wish I hadn't so I could show you some of the illustrations, but the colors are very vibrant, very childlike cartoons. It is appropriate for kids, for like middle grade aged kids, but it doesn't kind of gloss over the fact that this was not a nice place to grow up. I think for the audience, it gave just enough information to be truthful without being overtly like terrifying to read as a child. And I think it's really important as a tool to help kids understand, like, what is a refugee? Like, how do people become refugees? Like, what is a refugee camp like? What is a refugee camp? Why do they exist? It was just like such a wonderful book, such a wonderful book. So the story of Omar and Hassan, like I said, is true. I know some of the characters that are in the book that they interact with, like their friends, are fictional, but his story is by and large true. And to tell you that I sobbed my way through this book, I was not expecting it to hit me so hard. Just thinking about how children grow up in certain places, like in refugee camps, it was just it like tore out my soul. It is such a good book. Highly recommend it if you have kids around the like 10 to 12-year-old range. Yeah, I think this might have been the highlight of my reading month. It was so, so good. So the next book I want to talk about is the book I read on audio, which was let's see if I can get the title right. Why I Stopped Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. I thought this was really, really good. First of all, just the writing in general, it's straightforward. She gets to the point. She gives you enough context to understand the point, and she goes a bit further. Some things that I find frustrating, not really frustrating because I think it's more me just choosing the wrong nonfiction books to read. Sometimes I find that I'll read something that, while it was good, it wasn't meant for me. It was a bit too basic, and I'm by no means like an expert in anti-racism or anything, but I do know the basics, and I want a little bit more. I want to be stretched a little bit. I want more information that's not just the foundational pieces. So that's what I really appreciate this book, because I think it actually would work for a lot of different types of audience. I think it probably would be too rudimentary for someone who studies like critical race theory or is more of an expert in anti-racism or more experienced in anti-racism. Sorry, we're trying to ignore my cat right now. She's energetic at the moment. So like I was saying, I think it could work for a lot of people, unless you were really an expert or studying this, I guess, at a more academic level. I think it has enough stretching, enough challenging bits for people who this isn't their first book on anti-racism. Trying to talk about a serious book and my cat is just not having it. Sorry. So that being said, I also think this would work for those who are just starting to look into resources like nonfiction books about racism and anti-racism, because she contextualizes things so well. She gives a lot of examples that really help solidify her point, but it never feels redundant. It always feels like she's bringing in a fresh example to illustrate her point better. It never gets repetitive. I just thought that each bit of information was building on the last. I thought it was structured really well. She has it broke up into, I forget how many sections, but there's a section, the first section is more on like history of racism in Britain. I forgot to mention that this book specifically talks about racism through the lens of like living in the UK as a Black person. So a lot of the examples she uses are from like members of parliament, like politicians or other like leaders or people that if you are British, you probably know who that is. Now I'm Canadian and I didn't necessarily know who everyone was that she was talking about. I did know, I think probably the majority of them, but it really doesn't matter because she explains everything so clearly that you just get the point even if you don't know those specific people. But I think it is useful if you are British to have something that is focused on racism in the UK, because so many texts out there, at least the ones that are well known, are American. And I think sometimes it can be frustrating to not have a text about where you're at. So I think obviously if you are living in the UK, that can be really helpful, but it didn't deter me as a Canadian reading it from understanding it. Back to how it was structured. It started with kind of like the history of racism, specifically to the UK and imperialism. And there was a section dealing more on feminism, and each section kind of had a particular topic surrounding racism. And while they were all distinct, I do feel like they built on top of each other really well. So I would highly recommend this book. Like I said, unless you are an expert, you could probably get something out of the book. And the last book I want to talk about is The Yield by Tara June Winch. So this book is about a young woman who has left Australia. She's an Indigenous woman. She has left Australia. She's been living in the UK, and she returns because her grandfather, who helped to raise her, has passed away. She was raised mostly by her grandparents on this farm, and her grandfather, before he passed away, had been working on a dictionary, trying to preserve his language, his indigenous language. So this ended up really not being the book for me, which was real disappointment because I was so looking forward to this. One thing I really enjoyed about it was the shifting perspectives, I guess. So some of the chapters are from our main character, her name is August, from her perspective, moving back to this very small rural town, back to the farm, and dealing with all her feelings around her grandfather dying, about not being home for a long time, feeling cut off, I guess, from her indigeneity and feeling like disconnected from her culture. So that's one perspective. There's also chapters that are excerpts from her grandfather's dictionary. Instead of like a straight up definition, it will have like a sentence as a definition, but then a little anecdote or story relating to that word. And then the third perspective are these old journal entries, this letter that had been written by a settler who had started a mission, basically. He was a minister and he started this mission where the farm stands now, and kind of like the history of what happened to the people there. You have that mixed with the dictionary that gives kind of some more cultural context that really brings language into the story. And then you have the modern day perspective of this person who has been disconnected from that history. So that's really the premise. So my favorite part were the dictionary entries, the anecdotes that her grandfather was telling. I thought those were very compelling. I thought they gave you just enough information to kind of get a sense of important information or context. What I didn't like, and this was the meat of the book really, was the perspective from August. I couldn't get into her head as a character. And this is where the characterization problem I had comes in, I guess, is that I felt like she mostly, but really everyone in this book, all of the characters, were kept at arm's length. I found the writing cold, I guess, distant, and so she never really felt fully realized, which really frustrated me because something I love in books is going back to your small town. And I think maybe part of that arm's length distance might have been intentional, perhaps, because she does feel disconnected. She's coming back to this town and she feels like an alien there, someplace where she used to feel like she belonged as a kid, that felt like home to her, doesn't feel like home to her anymore. She's been gone so long. She feels like a foreigner in her own country, in her own town. So maybe that was intentional, but it just didn't work for me. I have to feel some sort of warmth, some sort of pull to a character. I need to know how they feel. I just felt that the characters were like off into the horizon. I couldn't get a sense of them. And the writing style didn't work for me. I found it a little too bland and cold. So this is very much a middle of the road review, I guess. Some things I liked, particularly the grandfather's dictionary entries and like those stories. And I liked what the author was trying to do with the language and the feeling of disconnect, but the writing style was not for me. I found like the writing style just did not elevate what could have been a really great story. But that's just my 2 cents. I am very much in the minority here. Most people who have read this have really, really loved it. So those were the books that I read in September. If you've read any of these, I would love to hear what you thought of them in the comments below. Thanks as always so much for watching, and we'll chat soon. Take care. Bye.